So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. Many thanks to the ECPR Standing Committee on Migration and Ethnicity, who organizes this webinar, usually monthly. So that's Daniela, Roberta, Verena, and Angeliki here with us. So thanks so much for having me, as well as our two invited speakers today, Dr. Feline Freier and Dr. Leiza Brumat. So both of them have published extensively on the topics that we will discuss today. And most recently, Feline was a guest editor in a special issue in International Migration. And Leiza's newest publication, I think just last week, in Third World Quarterly on refugee recognition in Brazil, are the latest that you can find. I will put them in the chat, so please check them out. So this is going to be an interview style webinar. So it's going to be a discussion, a back and forth of a few questions to both speakers. But feel free throughout to add questions in the chat. I will collect them, and then we'll have ample time at the end for Q&A. It will be about an hour in total. So thanks for joining us for the full hour. And again, as I said, we will not record the Q&A, so you can go back and watch the discussion later. So without further ado, let's jump into our topics of today. So I'm going to direct the first question to Feline, and I'd like to start with just a description, an overview of what's going on and what has been going on with the Venezuelan displacement crisis. So when did it begin? Kind of what are the causes? How many people are affected? And where are they headed? Just to give an idea for those who are not familiar with this particular displacement crisis, to get a background for our conversation.
Certainly. Thank you so very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. So I'm very often quite surprised when I talk about Venezuela and Venezuelan displacement outside of Latin America, that there's very little awareness for the scale of this crisis. So maybe starting at the back, right now we have over 7 million displaced Venezuelans outside of Venezuela, and 75% of them live or reside within the region, mainly South America and neighboring countries. So in global perspective, this makes it one of the biggest displacement crises in the world after Ukrainian displacement, and more or less, so I think now probably the numbers are even greater than Syrian displacement. And we certainly do not have this kind of policy and academic awareness for this crisis. We might discuss why this is the case. From a historic perspective, we need to understand that the immigration we're seeing currently started, but to a far lesser extent and on a much smaller scale when Hugo Chavez took power. But back then it was really mainly elites who did not agree with his economic policies, who left in the first instance, so in the early 2000s, followed by upper middle class, upper class, if we want to use those categories, migrants who left very often to study and then decided not to return, for example. So there's a bit of work on that. It's quite interesting. And then the current displacement crisis we're talking about goes back to the economic crisis that started in 2015. And then really spiraled out of control in the following years. The Economist, I think in 2020, called Venezuela the worst economic collapse outside of war in modern history. So the crisis in Venezuela really had multiple dimensions, but it certainly was an economic collapse, a political institutional crisis, and a humanitarian crisis. So the migrants we have interviewed, over the last couple of years, in the beginning, so I'm talking here 2018, 19, people would still be able to arrive in Peru, in this case, by plane or maybe by bus, but they had to sell everything they earned, everything they possessed in order to have enough money to buy that bus ticket. And then very quickly, we didn't even see people arrive by bus, but on foot, right? So we have these images, maybe some of you have seen them, of people walking from Venezuela to their destination countries across South America, carrying their children, carrying their few belongings, because as many of them have shared with us, whether they worked or not, did not matter. Yeah, I probably have to stop here, but we're talking inflation of, I don't even know, I think there was a forecast in 2018 by the International Monetary Fund of 1 million%. I don't think it ever came to that, but bottom line, whether people worked or did not work, if they did not receive dollars as remittances, it didn't matter. I don't want to go on. Vicky, maybe let me know whether you want me to talk a little bit about, very briefly maybe, what's been going on recently. Yeah, if I have a minute
that will be helpful.
Yeah, I'll do that. So what happened during the pandemic? Officially, borders were closed in South America, and South America was the region that was, I think, amongst the most severe, both in lockdowns and border closures, and even the militarization of borders, which led to securitization of migration in some countries, but I won't go into that. In reality, borders in Latin America are out of state control, and migration always continued. We know there was a decrease in flows definitely in the first months of the pandemic, but then very quickly we saw an increase of irregular crossings due to the borders closures. What we're seeing most recently, and here I think we have to understand that although the Venezuelan economy did experience a growth of 12% last year, it's really not enough to compensate for the damage that was done by the pandemic and the years of economic crisis and mismanagement previous to the pandemic. We really, I got some data here, sorry. So in 2021, the economy had shrunk 30%, right? And what we're seeing is that Venezuelans increasingly chose to migrate towards North America. That's the point I wanted to make. So we can discuss that also based on or due to failed integration, very difficult conditions in neighboring countries. We saw in a steep increase last year in crossings through the deadly Darien Gap, which is one of the deadliest migration routes in the world. Again, very little consciousness politically and academically about this fact. And we saw an increase of 60%, I think, of Venezuelans. Right now, those numbers are down. This is very, very clearly correlated, at the very least, with US policies and the application of Article 42 to Venezuelans versus previous attempts to grant legal status by the US government. I think I'll stop here for now. Maybe we can get back to the Darien Gap. It's horrendous. The stories you hear of survivors, I would call them survivors. So it's a stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama, and there are notorious human rights violations, especially gender-based violence, rapes. So a traumatic experience on all levels. And nevertheless, we see an increase of different nationalities, but also Venezuelans crossing. And now we have reports of Venezuelans actually coming back because they did not get into the United States. So that's the current situation. To summarize, more than 7 million displaced Venezuelans, the vast majority in the region, failed integration in many cases. An attempt to get to the United States, and right now it's not quite clear what's happening, but we also see return migration from the US towards the South again. And I'll stop here, but I'm sure, we'll get back to some of these points maybe in the discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks for the overview. And I mean, it was very detailed and descriptive. I think that it opens a lot of questions. So I think it's nice to take the talk, piece by piece, and then everyone can kind of gather their questions. At the end, we'll do a bit of more comparative views as well to see how this situation is relating elsewhere. But I like your point about, I think you said about 3/4 stay within South America, but at the same time, we see that other route channeling upwards. So it's important to look at the mobility at the individual level and the characteristics of people going in which direction. And that kind of leads into my next question, which I will direct at Leiza. about policy. So we heard a lot about the individual level and what's going on with the economic part, political part, humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and then a bit about the people leaving. So basically, the Venezuelans leaving, I would like to ask Leiza a bit more to talk about policy. So the policy reactions of the other countries that are receiving, and this is mostly within South America, since most of them are still within the region. So if you could take us through a bit, walk us through the changes that have happened through, the initial agreement or the initial receival of people, and then how this has developed over time in different policies towards different groups of Venezuelans in terms of migration governance and their individual policies. I know in your work, you've seen a lot of different patterns or trends of more restrictive, less restrictive. So the different legal statuses that are available to Venezuelans, and also maybe some access to regularization.
Thanks, Vicky, and hello, everyone. I would like to join Feline in thanking you for this invitation. It's great to be part of this awesome team of colleagues. And thanks, Vicky, for advertising these publications. I would like to add something to the overview that Feline just said, to this great overview, very detailed with numbers and everything. Something I would like to point out, first of all, is that the Venezuelan displacement crisis actually led to a very big disruptions in the traditional patterns of migration in South America, and which actually led to many countries that were traditional countries of emigration to be net countries of immigration, such as Ecuador, Peru, or Colombia itself, especially the Andean countries. This had an enormous impact on state capacity, and I will go back to the issue of state capacity, which I think is super important for this talk and for migration studies, especially in the Global South. And let's also remember at the same time that while many countries that were traditional countries of emigration turned into net countries of immigration, this crisis is one of the least funded crises in the world. So that said, I wanted to point out that when in 2015, when the crisis worsened, the first reaction of South American countries was to open borders, to keep borders open. In South America, many borders are actually open de facto, as Feline just mentioned. Sometimes it's not only for lack of control, but it is also a conscious decision to keep borders open, which is the case of Brazil. In some cases, it is more or less formalized, like Brazil has actually signed many bilateral agreements with some countries, for instance, with Paraguay, to keep borders open, but in other cases, borders are just open de facto. And these open borders de facto were kept open for the initial stage of the crisis, together with policies, open and liberal policies for liberalization, for regularization of these Venezuelan migrants. When the crisis worsened and it became obvious that people would keep leaving Venezuela, plus the pandemic, then the responses, the policy responses, started diverging quite broadly. But before saying this, I would like to point out that there are enormous differences in in Latin America, with what's considered to be Latin America as a region. I will talk mostly about South America, but we need to differentiate between South America on the one hand, and then Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America. They have very different migration flows, policy responses, and migration governance patterns. While Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico have policies and make policy decisions that are more related to the dynamics with the United States and also with their own intra-regional policy dynamics and migration flows, South America also is less dependent on the United States and dynamics and political dynamics with the US, and more dependent on intra-regional migration governance and migration flows and dynamics. So within South America, when these policy responses started diverging, I think that we can identify mainly two main groups. One is the Atlantic countries, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Colombia, with more liberal and welcoming decisions and easier paths for regularization, wider access to rights, and the Andean countries, which is these countries that I just mentioned, with exception of Colombia, the very important exception of Colombia, with adopting more restrictive policies, short-term residence permits, ad hoc visas and residence permits, militarization of borders, especially during the pandemic, restrictions in access to rights and deportations, especially in the case of Chile. So, to sum up, in my opinion, the crisis had two apparently contradictory effects on regional migration governance. On the one hand, it led to fragmentation, as many studies and a lot of the literature has already pointed out. So, together with the pandemic, it led to a fragmentation of policy responses, more open and closure coexisting, together with the abandonment of regional forums for migration, especially South American Conference on Migration. But on the other hand, it also fostered something that looks quite contradictory with this fragmentation. It fostered the use of regional instruments, of regional legal instruments for regularization. For instance, the Mercosur Residence Agreement and the Cartagena Agreement, the Cartagena definition for refugee in the case of Brazil. The Mercosur Residence Agreement is basically a residence permit that allows a 2-year permit, which can in turn become a permanent residence permit, which some countries have automatically turned into a permanent residency permit, which is the case of Uruguay, for instance. So it fostered the use of this regional legislation, of these regional norms for increasing access to rights and for increasing regularization paths. So we can see what happens in South America is that when crises arrive, there is a very clear difference and very different reactions, policy reactions from South American countries in regional terms than what happens in the European Union. For instance, in the European Union, we know that crises usually lead to more integration after a while, but they can usually lead to more integration. In South America, well, it really depends. And I think I'll leave it there. Do you need me to go on any other?
Yeah, thanks. No, that was great to start us off with the policy side. So great points about the fragmentation of policies, where some countries went more restrictive, like short-term visas, ad hoc reactions, deportations increased, whereas other ones took this very liberal view. And then drawing on regional instruments that already existed instead of making new ones. And I know that a lot of that using existent institutions and instruments is in your latest paper on Brazil. I would ask if you could just talk a little bit more about the Brazilian policy reaction, because I think it highlights nicely your last publication and is extremely interesting to see kind of these two coming together, because of course Bolsonaro was far right, but yet in the end, Brazil is implementing now a very kind of inclusive decision making. So maybe just to talk us through that a little bit to wrap up the policy part.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Brazil, I think it's a super interesting case because the Brazilian response to Venezuelan displacement actually challenges a lot the clear-cut binary between migrants and refugees. So Brazil, what actually does, especially at the border, but in general, is that when Venezuelans arrive at the border and they cross to Roraima, northern Brazil, they give them the option of choosing between applying to migratory status via the Mercosur Residence Agreement, or in fact, a copy-paste of the Mercosur Residence Agreement, or refugee status, independent from the reasons why Venezuelans left their country. So they arrive at the border and they tell them, would you like to apply for refugee status or migratory status? These are the differences. You have to pay for one. You don't need to pay for the other one. You can go back to Venezuela if you apply for refugee status. You can go back to Venezuela if you apply for migratory status. So they basically explain them what are their rights, what is the access to rights, and what they can do with both statuses. This decision by the Brazilian government, which actually started with a rightist government and was implemented by the Bolsonaro government, the far-right government, led to Brazil having the highest regularization rate of Venezuelans, around 74–75% against less than 50% in the rest of South American countries. What does this mean? This means many different things. Well, it can have some positive consequences. For instance, the high regularization rate and expanded access to rights in practice. But it also can mean that the non-differentiation between migrants and refugees can have negative consequences in terms of blurring the meaning of protection, the meaning of the figure of the refugee itself. However, we should also consider that Brazil is a country that has some of the most liberal and open migration and asylum policies in the world, which actually in practice provide more or less the same amount of rights to both migrants and refugees. So that those policies, that legislation and the practices that have been developed around these policies and legislation actually led to a blur between migrants and refugees in their actual and practical access to rights and the meaning of protection itself, which is very open, very holistic, and very broad, and that is, we're currently writing about that with Vicky. What is most surprising about this policy response of Brazil is who are the actors, the governance actors that promoted the non-differentiation between migrants and refugees. At the border, there is a very big operation called Operation Welcome or Shelter, depending on the translation. And in this operation, civil society organizations, international organizations, and the government participates. And this means that international organizations, including IOM and UNHCR, are promoting this non-differentiation. These two organizations that promote the clear-cut binary between migrants and refugees in Europe, for instance, don't do the same thing in global South countries, in South America in particular, in Brazil in particular. Why did Brazil do this? That it's the big question, and I think I'm running out of time. But in the article that Vicky has just shared with you, that we wrote with Andrew Geddes, we say that it's an issue of, as just mentioned before, state capacity. Regularization in South America is a venue for increasing the state control, the control of the state in its territory, and is crucially aided by bureaucracies that are very institutionalized in specific policy areas. It's also questioned, so first is the capacity, second foreign policy and opposition to the Maduro regime, and third, regional norms that align with these liberal, open, and progressive understandings of migration and ideas around migration persist South America. What I sustain is that there is a South American approach to migration governance, and we can see it in the practices, in the ideas that policymakers and policy implementers sustain and apply in practice on the ground.
That's, yeah, excellent overview. There's a lot in there, and I think that depending on everyone's interest in the audience, yeah, we'll ask questions, but it's fascinating because of the plethora of policy actors that's involved, which I know that you've spoken to many of them, you know, firsthand. And you moved so nicely from policy discussion and the reactions at the government levels, trickling down, interacting with other international organizations, and then the conceptual impact. So us as researchers interested in these type of crises, you know, obviously we're interested on what the policies say on paper, what type of legal statuses are available, what is the access to regularization, et cetera, but then the conceptual impact and the real impact on the ground, who's accessing what, and how are they doing that, and how are those policy actors offering the different options. And I mean, Brazil is just this fascinating reaction of this non-distinction, non-differentiation between the motive for leaving and then just applying for migrant or refugee status, which I think for this audience, it's quite shocking to see this being put in practice. So, reserving the end for the Q&A, I'll direct another question to Feline before we move to the audience. So, I mean, it's been mentioned a lot already, and thank you for that, to talk about some comparative differences. So putting a comparative lens on this, and I'm hoping that our audience members are specialized in different areas of the world and different crises. So putting kind of a comparative lens on what we've talked about so far, Feline, if you could comment a little bit on what kind of approaches this means for us as researchers interested in migration and ethnicity to study migrants, refugees, and displacement crises. So whether that's in terms of methods, concepts, levels of analysis, and then, what can we discuss now that helps us undertake comparative work, especially whether it's different time periods or different regions. I know we've mentioned a lot about Europe, mostly because of where we're based, but EU crises versus the crisis that we just spoke about. Leiza mentioned the EU binary being really pushed by international organizations of this distinction between migrants and refugees, and then that not really being a huge factor in practice in some regards, and as well state capacity, as was mentioned. So a little bit more about like a comparative lens and some of your takeaways, Feline.
Sure. If you allow me to share the screen, I actually have one slide that I think might be really useful. So I just wanted to show this because I think it speaks to two things: the scale and the really exponential increase of displacement, and this only goes until 2020. Like I need to update it. But what we see are three things. We see I'll start with blue, refugees recognized in Latin America from a historic perspective, so from 1970 to 2020. What we see in the late 80s, early 1990s is contemporary Central American displacement, mainly to Mexico. We also see it increase 2008-9. These are mainly Colombians recognized as refugees in Ecuador, right? And then we have in yellow asylum seekers. So we do see an increase, and these are mainly Venezuelans in 2019-20. But then we see something else in red. And it's the infamous, I would say, UNHCR category of Venezuelans displaced outside of Venezuela, which was a new category invented by the UNHCR in the 2019 report. Based on very new research we conducted across the region, apparently they're going to take it back and include Venezuelans in other people of concern as of this year. But this says something. So again, it's the scale and the increase of the displacement, and it's the lack of recognition of Venezuelans as refugees, despite the applicability of the definition of Cartagena, which most countries have incorporated in their national legislation. And Leiza, you spoke about the outlier, right? Brazil, but most countries did not apply Cartagena and did not recognize Venezuelans as refugees. So this leads me a little bit, maybe from the back to your question, Vicky, because I think Latin America invites us a lot to think about categorization, discourse, and the impact of categorization and discourse on policies, policy options, and real-life consequences for displaced populations. So actually, we have a project at the UP where we're looking at this category of Venezuelans displaced abroad, and we asked policymakers and UNHCR, IOM, and NGO representatives across the region, do they know this category? Has it been used? And what do they think was the effect of calling Venezuelans this and not, either migrants or refugees or people of concern? And here, like our colleague Acosta and I have been thinking about what's been called the reflexive turn in migration studies, right? This need to see how categorizations and categories, and I can stop sharing the screen, have an impact, no? And I think especially an impact in this case on policy options. But if we think about, reflexivity in migration studies, very often we think about how do restrictive categories and restrictive discourses affect policies and integration and xenophobia, right? So in Latin America, we have this unique laboratory where discourses have been extremely positive. And we, on the one hand side, I think from a reflexive theoretical perspective, we can ask, well, has this actually made a difference in real life and in practice or not? And here we have, for example, the UNHCR, who has praised Latin America as the avant-garde of expansive, liberal and generous refugee legislation. What has happened in practice, right? With Gio Acosta, we have an article forthcoming where we discuss this, and we identify 3 areas. So refugee studies or refugee recognition, regularization, and nationalization. And why? Because, part of the liberal turn that Leiza also discussed has been not only refugee legislation, but the decriminalization of irregular migration, and in some cases, the glorious right to migrate, right? Which in theory should lead to facilitation of dual citizenship. So that said, and again, maybe I started a little bit from the back, if we think about why and how we should study migration and refugee policies and migration management in Latin America from a comparative perspective, zooming in, I think there's a lot more work to be done comparing. Leiza, you spoke about the Atlantic and the Andean countries. How do we actually, what proof is there? What evidence-based political science can we conduct to explain those differences? Yeah, and here we I think sometimes scholars working in Latin America, we face the challenge that very often, first of all, we have to describe and prove, that certain patterns exist, because that literature doesn't necessarily exist, to then actually be able to try to come to the more explanatory work, right, of explaining these patterns or processes, which takes time, but it's necessary. So I think there's still a lot to be done, comparing countries, comparing policy reactions, really trying to get at why do we see those differences. And then if we think about a cross-regional perspective, or comparing Latin America and Europe, or maybe, sub-Saharan Africa, other regions in the global south, if we even want to use this category, we can discuss that in the debate. We have to be careful to not only test existing theory in a region in the south, because that's something I see a lot, and I think it's not enough, because the local and regional literature does exist. So I think we really have to make the effort to compare maybe the more, what do you want to call it? It's not very decolonial of me, but the more standard or common or mainstream literature with the regional literature, right? See what are similarities and differences, because very often there are already theoretically some advances, very often only descriptive, in-depth case studies, but they're useful, right, to develop theory. So we have to do that extra, we have to go that extra mile to really do in-depth literature reviews, no matter what topic, compare the mainstream with the regional or local literature, and then see what kind of data we can actually use or collect to test both, and then really see how the regional case can also help us, or cases can also help us to advance theory more generally. And maybe it's not possible. Maybe, there won't be one coherent theory for migration policies. Maybe, we have to think more in terms of explaining migration policies in predominantly sending countries. But Leiza, you spoke about the big disruptive force of Venezuelan displacement and how that has changed for many countries. But that would be my great appeal. Don't only try to test theory, in the global south, but actually go the extra mile, see what's already been done, take, local knowledge production serious. And then, I've worked with tables. What does the mainstream literature say? What does the regional literature say? Where's the overlap? Where are the differences? And then how can we test both? And then in terms of topics, I mean, again, that's not very reflexive from me, probably, if I talk about Latin America or Venezuela as a laboratory, but there is so much to be studied. And it's been such a pleasure and honor to be able to lead interdisciplinary research team at the UP, where we not only looked at policy, we looked at the impact of policy, we looked at the impact of policy on mental health, integration, lack of integration. I mean, there's just so much to be done. And I'm a little bit disappointed because I feel from especially international students that approach me that it's the same topics that get a lot of attention. So securitization of migration policies, and but it's been done, there's so much more to do, right? So and maybe that's something we can discuss all together now, but those would be my main points. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, looking beyond, testing a theory in a new context, there's so much more and different impacts. And I liked a lot what you said about the concepts, the discourse, and then the impact on policies, because within that, each part, there's so much to unpack and much room for comparison. So looking forward to that reflexivity paper as well. And I think it's important that the two of you connected as well on the UNHCR and the huge role that it has around the world as a very influential actor in what governments are actually doing on the ground, implementing policy in this new category of, typically we think of concepts coming from academia of how we talk about migration and migrants. But in reality, there are many other very influential, powerful actors like the UNHCR that just invents a category. And then, how is that being used? And it affects all of the data measurements that we have access to.